The topic I'm going to speak about today is the genius of India and the crisis of civilization. Well, I'd like to invert the sequence a little bit in my consideration to talk about the crisis of civilization and the genius of India. So, when we say the crisis of civilization, what is the crisis of civilization? The crisis of civilization is a crisis that involves us all. It is a world crisis of a world civilization. We may ask the question, why crisis and what crisis? Today it is not difficult to acknowledge crisis. We are all faced with one or more ongoing crises. We have a crisis of the geosphere, a crisis of the biosphere, and a crisis of the cultural sphere. These crises of our times are premised on the close interrelationship of the contemporary world. An interrelationship or globality that seems to be at its height in history. We receive real-time data from across the world. We are able to contact any point of the world at any time. We enjoy commodities and services from across the world at near instantaneous periods. We can obtain knowledge about events from across the world and throughout history at the press of a button. And we can influence events remotely, enjoying action at a distance. Since the 21st century, our human footprint spans the remotest corners of the earth, so that we characterize ourselves as having entered a new geologic era, the era of the human, the Anthropocene. We enjoy a rational omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence which is unprecedented in world history. Of course, by we, I mean some of us. Yet we, and now I mean all of us, also experience pandemics, cataclysmic climate events, and global terror at the same near instantaneous speeds. This is the crisis of civilization, this chronic dystopia rather than expected utopia. To move to civilization. Today we talk of the crisis of civilization, meaning the global civilization of modernity or post-modernity. But this was not the only civilization there was at one time, not even so long back. About a century back, there is the apocryphal story of M.K. Gandhi, who, when he was asked what he thought about modern civilization, replied, "It would be a good idea." A few centuries prior to that, some British emissaries who visited China hoping to impress the Qianlong Emperor with technological gifts so as to gain trading rights were perceived as bringing worthless tributes of barbarians to the superior Chinese civilization. Such pre-modern notions of civilization still live on in the subjective recesses of nations, but these are submerged under a hegemonic world civilization. This is what we know today as civilization. Civilization rests on a definition of the human based in the European Enlightenment, a definition centered in the rational ego or cogito. The Enlightenment is a movement of European intellectual history going back to the 17th century that may be seen as the source of the institutional and cultural revolution leading to our times. It is characterized by systematic turn to know the world and its knower, using reason so as to create a better world. Compared to the pre-modern European world, it was a displacement of the authority of the God as represented in the church to God's prime property, the Logos, given to human beings as reason, so as to come to the full knowledge of reality and use this knowledge to make a perfect world. This is the Enlightenment's will to knowledge. It is premised on the separation of the subject and the object, and of a piecing together of knowledge to form a single whole, a systems theory of everything. The first, the separation of subject and object, is a dualism. It forgets that the subject is inextricable from the object. The second is a fragmentation. It forgets that the sum of broken parts is never the whole. Thirdly, the centering of knowledge in the rational ego or cogito is subject to the law of mind, for which, if something is known as true, all else than that can't be true. From this understanding, each subject is a center of truth. All others are either illusory or subordinate. Moreover, behind this will to knowledge is the will to power, to use the knowledge to its advantage, to exploit its others. This is the irrational delirium of power that uses knowledge. It has resulted in colonialism across the non-Western world. And today, we see it in neoliberal global capitalism. The rape of the earth's resources, its clogging and poisoning with indiscriminate waste, its destruction of natural ecologies and ecosophies, its continued economic exploitation and cultural subjugation of the Third World. The result is what we see everywhere as the crisis of civilization. The revolt of the earth in climate events, the infection of the bios and the zoos with increasingly intractable diseases, the refusal of civilization by the disenfranchised of modernity, and the formation of decentralized, cancerous orthodoxies waging war against modernity. Is there one or more solution to all this? The topic references the genius of India. Now, genius in its common understanding is unfortunately a self-congratulatory term, bolstering a national egoism and partaking of civilizational competitionism. Can we understand genius in any other way? Genius, sometimes referred to as genie, is a noun that takes its origin in terms of spirit or soul. Genius, in this sense, is a spirit entity. The genius of India, seen thus, may be rethought to be the spirit or soul of India. Can we think of India as having a soul? Sri Aurobindo, for example, talks of nation souls. What is a nation soul? The idea of a nation soul arises in modern times in Germany with thinkers like Johann Gottfried Herder and G.W.F. Hegel. This notion of a national soul has been severely criticized in our times as an essentialism, with dangerous overtones that could lead to the kind of situation we saw in World War II. Here we come back to the pre-modern idea of civilization as a national ego that still lives in the depths of nations in various regions of the world. Sri Aurobindo cautions against this kind of essentialistic understanding of nation soul in his chapter True and False Subjectivism in his book The Human Cycle. The nation soul emerges over time with the consolidation of driving tendencies in cultural history. Moreover, the nation soul is porous. It moves in its own way towards universality. And the nation soul knows its oneness with all other national and individual entities, while at the same time experiencing and expressing its uniqueness as an evolving cultural entity. Can we think of India in this way as a nation soul, a shared cultural conversation around ideas that grow, evolve, and move towards universality, while considering all others as essentially the same, if manifestly different? Often in thinking about India, it has been characterized as a spiritual civilization versus the materialism of the West. But this is an Orientalistic and binary thinking. The term spiritual exists in a binary relationship with material, as if spirit and matter are opposites. Though there is a world-negating streak to Indian culture, this is not what defines or determines it. Spirituality is not necessarily in opposition to materiality in Indian history. If we are to look more closely, what characterizes the continuing concerns of Indian philosophical thought, or darshan, and practice, or yoga, are questions concerning the possibilities of consciousness in experiencing and becoming other than what we are. It concerns itself with the responses of consciousness to the problems of the time in finding solutions of cosmic and non-dual realization, not in objectification of the problem, but in the point of oneness of subject and object. This inversion does not assume a fixed definition of the human, but a ground of individual experiment and metamorphosis. This has spawned a vast field of plural approaches to reality and self-becoming from different psychological points of approach. This is the field of yoga, understood broadly as experimental praxis leading to union of consciousness with those we consider our others. Comparing to modern civilization, this is a civilizational alternative, not the knowing of the laws of a static objective world by a static rational subject, but the discovery of oneness with an aspect of cosmic consciousness by transformation and self-exceeding of the subject. This has resulted in a space of plurality of definitions of reality, as well as of the human as a structure of becoming. But this plurality coexists on the assumed basis of a paradoxical absolute that is one and infinite at the same time. The truth is one, the sages speak of it differently, writes the Veda, or the one infinite of the Upanishad, or Anekantavada of the Jains. Can we turn this approach to reality in addressing the crisis of civilization? To do this, we need to identify the problems of our time as new problems of becoming, to be tackled by consciousness at the individual and collective levels. Our solutions must start not from states and institutions, but from our own lives. States and institutions are not irrelevant. They exist to support environments for individual and communitarian engagement with the problems of our time. But our solutions must start from the individual and from the voluntary grouping of individuals in intentional communities. What are the foundations of the crisis of our times? At the center of our problems, we may think of identity politics that creates boundaries of self and other in terms of the living and non-living, the human and non-human, races, nationalities, ethnicities, genders, classes, religions, and their others, down to families, communities, and individuals and their others. As we saw with the law of mind, anything that we take to be ourselves as true, the other or its other is not true, or is subordinate, or illusory. Modernity creates classificatory identities and pins our rational egos to these, so that our others are to varying degrees irrelevant to us. They are our objects fit for distancing, bypassing, managing, subjugating, exploiting, exiling, or exterminating. If instead we consider our problem of becoming as one in which we expand our sense of self to find it everywhere, this opens a field of experimentation of consciousness, seeking plural ways to oneness. Can we realize in consciousness our inextricability and oneness with the objects of our attention and relation? This requires a different metaphysics and a different praxis than what the Enlightenment has given us. The metaphysics of the Enlightenment is a subject-object duality. What we require is a metaphysics of deep monism, the essential oneness of all beings and things, at the same time the radical uniqueness of all beings as forms of becoming or manifestation in time. The praxis of the Enlightenment is one of subjective mastery over its objects. But what we require is a praxis of deep relationality, leading to liminal states of intimacy where oneness and difference coexist. Can we experience the earth as our extended bodies? Can we experience the life of the earth as our extended vitality? Can we experience the ideas and ideologies of the world as our extended cosmic mentality? This kind of praxis has to be stabilized at the individual level through the formation of symbolic earth communities, groupings of individuals representing various cultures, living in a built habitus shared with the earth and its plant and animal world. The shared life must be underlined by will to deep relationality and oneness experienced in consciousness. In our attempts at such forms of unity, we explore a new yoga and turn to new purposes, what we call the spirit or genius of India. In this we may recollect the Mother's words, quote, "A Gnostic or supramental community can exist only on the basis of the inner realization of each of its members, each one realizing his real concrete unity and identity with all the other members of the community. That is, each one should feel not like just one member united in some way with the others, but all as one within himself. For each one, the others must be himself as much as his own body, and not mentally and artificially, but by a fact of consciousness, by an inner realization." Unquote. As mentioned, such experimental communities must be supported by institutions and states which affirm the essential unity of all things at the spiritual level, the deep interdependence of all things at the universal level, and the right to unique expressions and choices of becoming of all beings at the individual level. The symbolic experiments and realizations of individuals and communities must be accompanied with a worldwide aspiration, as expressed by the Mother in her last New Year's message. Quote, "When you are conscious of the whole world at the same time, then you can become conscious of the divine." The crisis of civilization thus demands a revolution of consciousness, a revolution leading to a new realization of what it means to be human, or rather post-human, a coexistence of realized plurality and oneness. If the genius of India is to live up to this promise, it needs to rediscover its heritage of experimentation and consciousness and apply this to the problems of our time. This is a new engagement with a new horizon of expectation, a horizon of paradoxicality in which radical pluralism is the same as absolute oneness. Such a horizon can only be achieved by a consciousness that exceeds mind, something that has been defined by Sri Aurobindo as the supermind.